Was the you can call me Nightmare Mr. Fear. It's Nightmare Mr. Fear actor. Because it's time for my reaction, live reaction to 10 unsolved mysteries that happen on Halloween by Mr. Nightmare. So yeah, let's go. Shall we? Hang on. Gonna mute this down. Let's do it.
Halloween is the one night of the year where being scared is supposed to be good fun. However, amid all the harmless activities like trick-or-treating, sometimes genuinely frightening and disturbing things can happen.
Of course.
October 31st has been the date of some horrific murders and unexplained disappearances, which are far more terrifying than any ghouls, goblins, or witches. Because they happen to take place on Halloween, the following mysteries have horrific murders and unexplained disappearances, which are far more terrifying than any ghouls, goblins, or witches. Because they happen to take place on Halloween, the following mysteries have an extra aura of creepiness to them, and they remain unsolved to this day. Number 10. The murders of Ronald Sisman and Elizabeth Platzman. Sometime during the early morning Halloween hours of 1981, a Manhattan couple named Ronald Sisman and Elizabeth Platzman were murdered in their apartment. The couple was severely beaten before being shot in the head, execution style, and the apartment was completely ransacked. Sisman was rumored to be involved with drugs, so authorities initially believed that to be the motive of the killings. However, the case took a bizarre turn when a prison informant claimed that one of his fellow inmates had somehow predicted the crime weeks before it actually happened. That inmate turned out to be none other than the notorious Son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz. In 1977, Berkowitz was convicted of a series of shootings which took the lives of 6 victims and left 7 others wounded. There has always been speculation that Berkowitz was involved with a satanic cult and did not commit all the Son of Sam murders on his own. According to the informant, Berkowitz had told him that his cult was planning to enter a residence near Greenwich Village on Halloween. They would perform a ritual murder by shooting a couple in the head before ransacking the place to remove incriminating evidence. When questioned about this, Berkowitz claimed that Sisman possessed snuff footage of one of the Son of Sam shootings and was planning to hand it over to authorities to avoid some drug charges. While no evidence was found to support Berkowitz's claims, he did provide an eerily accurate description of Sisman's apartment. No one knows if the murders of Sisman and Platzman had anything to do with the Son of Sam case, but they're still unsolved. Number 9. The disappearance of Cindy Song. Cindy Song was a 21-year-old South Korean student attending Pennsylvania State University. In 2001, she dressed up in a bunny costume and attended a Halloween party at a nightclub in State College. After leaving the club, Cindy's Korean student attending Pennsylvania State University. In 2001, she dressed up in a bunny costume and attended a Halloween party at a nightclub in State College. After leaving the club, Cindy spent the next few hours hanging out with her friends before she was dropped off at her apartment at 4 a.m. This was the last anyone ever saw of her. After Cindy was reported missing, a search was conducted of her apartment. There was no sign of any struggle, but many of her belongings, including the false eyelashes from her costume, were there, indicating that she had gone inside after being dropped off.
Right.
But what happened to her afterward? Shortly thereafter, a witness reported seeing a woman resembling Cindy in the Chinatown district of Philadelphia.
Really?
This woman was inside a vehicle with an unidentified male and crying for help. A bizarre lead came about in 2003 when a Luzerne County man named Hugo Marcus Solinsky was arrested after the remains of 5 people were found buried in his backyard. Even though none of the remains belonged to Cindy, an informant told police that Solinsky and an accomplice named Michael Jason Krakowski Jr. had abducted her.
No way.
After Cindy was raped and killed, the 2 men allegedly buried her body at another location. Krakowski's remains were found in Solinsky's backyard, and the informant claimed that Krakowski was murdered for keeping Cindy's bunny ears as a souvenir. So far, no evidence was found to tie Solinsky to Cindy's disappearance. But in January 2014, the burned remains of a dozen more people were found buried on his property.
What?
It remains to be seen if any of them will be identified as Cindy San. Number 8. The murder of Nima Louise Carter. On Halloween night in 1977, the parents of 19-month-old Nima Louise Carter placed their child inside her crib at their Lawton, Oklahoma home. The next morning, Nima's parents were shocked to discover that she was missing. Since the windows in Nima's bedroom were locked, it's theorized that her abductor had been hiding in her closet and snuck the child out of the house while her parents were sleeping in the living room. A month later, a group of kids were playing in an abandoned house 4 blocks away from the Carter home. When they opened up the house's refrigerator, they received a horrifying shock when the decomposed body of an infant came tumbling out.
What?
The child was identified as Nima Louise Carter, who died of suffocation. A similar crime had occurred in Lawton in April 1976, when a pair of 3-year-old twin sisters, Mary and Tina Carpenter, were lured out of their home by a young woman and forcibly confined inside a fridge at another abandoned house. When the sisters were found 2 days later, Mary had suffocated, but Tina managed to survive. Tina identified her abductor as a local teenage babysitter named Jacqueline Rubadux. However, the child's age made her testimony unreliable, and there wasn't enough evidence to file charges at that time. Jacqueline Rubadux eventually became a babysitter for Nima Louise Carter. She was an obvious suspect after Nima's murder, but once again, there was no evidence to implicate her. Years later, Rubadux was finally charged with Mary Carpenter's murder and given a life sentence. She died in prison of liver cancer in 2005, but never admitted to the still unsolved mystery of Nima Louise Carter. Number 7. The murder of Shane Weiss. Shane Weiss was a 15-year-old Orthodox Jewish boy attending a Jewish high school on Long Beach, New York. The morning after Halloween in 1986, the entire school was horrified when Shane was found murdered on his dorm room floor.
What?
He was repeatedly stabbed in the head, but no murder weapon could be found anywhere. Since there was no evidence of a struggle, it seemed likely that Shane was killed in his bed while he slept before his body was moved to the floor. Shane was a very liked boy, so no one could figure out a possible motive for the crime. There were signs that the killer was familiar with the religious customs of Orthodox Judaism. Even though it had been a chilly night, the window in Shane's room was left open, a custom which is often done to let the deceased person's spirit out. After the murder, one of the school's rabbis left a memorial candle to burn in Shane's room. 2 days later, a second candle appeared, but no one ever admitted to putting it there.
If I had to guess, most
There
must
were no
be
signs of forced entry anywhere, indicating the killer may have been familiar with the dormitory.
the killer's motive must have been like he was jealous or something. He was well liked, you said, right?
The door to his room was opened before it was immediately shut again. Could the killer have initially entered the wrong room by mistake? After 28 years, authorities have never been able to find a suspect or any answers about why Shane West was murdered in such a brutal fashion.
Or maybe he wanted to do something as a belief.
Number 6,
Into a belief.
the identity of orange socks.
That's crazy. That's crazy. That, you know, like, yeah, it's sad. Probably for like a religious belief, see if his spirit would leave through the window, leave the room. Maybe that's what was another motive, to see if that religion works. See if that belief, like, they would be his spirit would go to heaven, or I don't know. Believe his spirit would go, leave his room, you know.
Halloween in 1979, the unidentified body of a young woman was found in a concrete culvert near Interstate 35, just outside of Georgetown, Texas.
Never been to Texas.
The victim appeared to be
So
in her
I actually like
20s
to go
and
one
had
day.
been sexually assaulted before she was strangled to death. It seemed likely that she was murdered that very same day.
Oh, I bet.
The unique clue to her identity was a silver oval-shaped ring on her hand.
Ah.
The victim was nude, and the only garment of clothing she had on was a pair of orange socks. Since the young woman was never identified, Orange Socks became her nickname. Years later, serial killer Henry Lee Lucas confessed to the murder of Orange Socks. He even stated that he had sex with her.
I met the guy who played. I met the guy who played him in a movie a few weeks ago. Michael Rooker.
While hitchhiking, and only remembered that After being sentenced to death for the woman's murder in 1984, Lucas took back his confession in order to have his sentence changed. Further investigation showed that Lucas was likely working in Florida on the day of the murder. Lucas was notorious for frequently confessing to murders he never committed, and no one is sure how many people he's actually killed. Henry Lee Lucas died in prison in 2001, but Orange Socks is not the only unidentified murder victim that he's been connected to. Number 5. The Missing Trick-or-Treater. In 2007, 12-year-old Bradley Hirsch was trick-or-treating with a group of friends in Colorado. The boys who were with Bradley early on in the night said that they were just going along with their trick-or-treating when one of the boys picked up on the fact that Bradley was missing. They retraced their steps in an attempt to find him, and disturbingly found his cowboy hat sitting by the curb. Bradley was dressed in a homemade cowboy costume that day. A little ways up the road, Bradley's bag of candy was found as well, spilled out onto the street, almost leaving a trail. That was the last of Bradley's possessions that were found by the boys that night. It's unknown how Bradley disappeared without anyone noticing, but the most likely explanation would have to be that Bradley at some point wandered off on his own, leaving him vulnerable to predators on their favorite night of the year. But the only thing that may take away some credibility of that possibility would be the fact that a week later, Bradley's mother found his glasses in the backyard. The strange part? Bradley's friends all said he was wearing glasses the last time they saw him. Bradley is still missing to this day. Number 4. In 1982, 69-year-old Marvin Bradlin lived with his wife, Ethel, in Fort Dodge, Iowa. On Halloween that year, the Bradlins were handing out candy to trick-or-treaters who came to their house. At one point, they answered the door and were surprised to see a man wearing a mask. He said, "Trick or treat, give me your money or I'll shoot."
What?
The Bradlins thought someone was playing a Halloween prank and tried to remove the man's mask, but he wouldn't let them. Instead, the masked man entered the house and pulled out a gun. He demanded that the couple bring him down to the basement and give him all the money they had stashed in their safe. The Bradlins became suspicious since very few people knew they even had a safe in their basement. For this reason, Marvin was still convinced that a friend or family member was still playing a Halloween trick on them. When the masked man led the Bradlins
Bet it
through
was
the
someone
kitchen
they
to
knew.
the basement, Marvin made a grab for the gun. The intruder wound up shooting Marvin in the throat before fleeing the house and inexplicably leaving his mask behind. Ethel was so traumatized by her husband's death that she died only a few months later. Over the years, an acquaintance of the Bradlin family had allegedly bragged about committing the murder, so DNA testing was performed on the mask.
I bet it was someone they
There
knew.
wasn't enough usable material for an adequate test.
What?
So there's still no evidence to charge the suspects.
No.
This mystery still remains unsolved.
Oh
Number
man.
3. The death of the Key West newborn. On
Newborn?
the morning of October 31st, 2004, a housekeeper at the Hilton Resort in Key West, Florida, found something in the garbage bin of the ladies' room in the lobby. She may have initially assumed it was a Halloween prank, but the situation became truly horrific once she realized she had found the body of a newborn infant girl. The child still had the umbilical cord and the placenta attached to her body, indicating that someone recently gave birth to this girl and decided to just toss her into the trash. It didn't take authorities long to figure out who was responsible.
Who was
Hours
it?
earlier, a young pregnant woman and 3 male companions were seen walking through the hotel lobby. She entered the ladies' room while the men waited outside. At one point, a female witness went into the washroom and heard the pregnant woman moaning inside the stall. When the witness asked the 3 men if they knew the woman, one of them claimed to be her boyfriend. He even called out her name at one point, which sounded like Samantha or Sonia, according to the witness. The pregnant woman was in the bathroom for approximately 40 minutes, and a security guard saw her clutching her stomach when she exited. When the guard asked if she was alright, he was told she had gotten sick by partying too much at the nearby Fantasy Fest. The 4 individuals were escorted out of the hotel, but the child was not discovered until morning. Fingerprints, blood samples, and DNA evidence were taken from the washroom and compared to several suspects. However, the mother and the 3 men have yet to be identified, and no one has been prosecuted for the newborn's death. Number 2. The mysterious death of Chris Jenkins. Chris Jenkins was a 21-year-old student from the University of Minnesota who visited a downtown Minneapolis bar on Halloween night in 2002. After leaving the bar around midnight, Chris vanished without a trace. He remained a missing person for 4 months until his body was discovered in the Mississippi River. Since Chris was still wearing his Halloween costume, all indications were that he died shortly after he disappeared. Chris was heavily intoxicated that night, and since his cause of death was determined to be drowning, authorities initially believed it was an accident or suicide. His parents refused to believe this and pressed for a more thorough investigation. Finally, in 2006, the death was reclassified as a homicide. While the authorities have withheld specific details, they claim that an imprisoned suspect told them that he was present when Chris was murdered and thrown off the bridge into the river. Even though police believe this man's story to be credible, no charges have ever been filed. However, one possible theory is that Chris Jenkins could have been a victim in the mysterious smiley face murders. During this time period, approximately 40 male college students in the United States were victims in a bizarre series of drowning deaths. In some of these cases, unexplained smiley face graffiti was found near the body of water where the victim was drowned. This had led some to theorize these deaths are connected and that these victims were drugged before being thrown into a body of water to make their murder look like an accidental drowning. While no smiley face graffiti was ever found in connection to Chris Jenkins' death, the similarities to many other cases cannot be overlooked. Number 1. The disappearance of Stephen DeMond. On Halloween in 1955, Marilyn DeMond took her 2-year-old son, Stephen, and 7-month-old daughter, Pamela, to a supermarket in East Meadow, New York. While she went shopping, Marilyn let Stephen wait outside the store with his sister, who was inside a carriage. 10 minutes later, Marilyn exited the store and was shocked to discover that both Stephen and the carriage were gone. Shortly thereafter, the carriage was discovered about a block and a half away. However, even though Pamela had been left behind inside the carriage, Stephen was nowhere to be found. He has not been seen since.
What?
In many cases where infants are abducted, it's theorized that the perpetrator wanted a child of their own and decided to raise the missing infant under a new name. Over the years, DNA testing has been utilized in an attempt to determine if Stephen DeMond was ever given a new identity.
What happened?
At one point, investigators noticed that Stephen bore a resemblance to the infamous boy in the box, an unidentified child who was found murdered inside a cardboard box in Philadelphia in 1957. However, DNA testing would eventually confirm that Stephen and the boy in the box were not the same person. In 2009, a Michigan man named John Barnes came forward believing he might be Stephen, but DNA testing also ruled this out. It's possible that an adult Stephen DeMond might be living another life somewhere under a different identity, unaware that he was once taken from his real family. However, his whereabouts continue to remain unknown. And for the record, you can't expect anything good to happen if you leave a carriage outside a supermarket with a 2-year-old and a 7-month-old completely unsupervised.
That's crazy stuff, people. Like I mean, if I were that lady, I wouldn't have left my kids unsupervised outside of a supermarket. I would bring them along with me. Like, plus, plus 2-year-old and a few months old baby. Like, what do you think's gonna happen if you leave them unsupervised? I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. Halloween's coming up, people. Be careful. Be safe. Um, be there and be nice to people, please. And Mr. Nightmare's channel is awesome. I'll put the link to his channel in the description below. He's awesome. Like, Halloween's one of the times when you scare people for fun. Try not to make it too much of a scare, people. So, rate, comment, subscribe. Your favorite Tokyo Peace. Check out Mr. Nightmare. Subscribe to him. Peace.